that quote, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, it is kind of used as like, here's this timeless wisdom about the reality of power in the world. But the way it's meant in the book, at least I think an interpretation of the way it's meant in the book is these are people totally drunk on their own power. They have no interest in diplomacy. They have no interest in negotiating with those they consider weaker than them. And so they said, look, this is what you have to do. Otherwise, you suffer. The millions say no, and they do suffer. But Athens is so drunk on its power that, it starts the Sicilian expedition a year later, loses a lot of its navy and its army, and just loses the war, loses its empire. Its walls are destroyed. So I think the point of that quote, which I think Carney is correct about, is that this is not the eternal equilibrium of history. It's that people who think rules don't apply to them will find themselves under very difficult circumstances. People who think they've risen above and they don't need the so-called weak anymore will find themselves overmatched very quickly. That's what happened to Athens, and I think we're seeing some of that happening in the US as well. I mean, just look at Iran, where the US starts this war.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied periods of upheaval or tyranny, or who have figured out how to survive and thrive under strongman rule. Today, my guest is Seva Gunitsky. He is Associate Professor and George Ignatieff Chair of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Toronto. He's the author of Aftershocks, Great Powers and Domestic Reforms in the 20th Century, and many other scholarly works on Russian and late Soviet politics, international relations, democratic waves, hegemonic transitions, and great power rivalries. He is also the author of one of my favorite newsletters, Hegemon. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Seva.
Oh, Jim, I think it's a very gracious introduction. Pleasure being here.
Let's start with a little bit about yourself. You hold, and your position in our current crazy world, you hold the George Ignatieff Chair of Peace and Conflict Studies. Ignatieff being the Russian-born Canadian diplomat who helped create the United Nations peacekeeping framework. That's a weighty institutional inheritance. How does that lineage sit with you given the current state of the world? I don't know if you can call it a poly-crisis or a poly-fucked-upness, but by my count, there are about 20 significant conflicts happening around the world right now, from Iran to the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah. So for very selfish reasons, I'm glad that it's a person that I actually respect and admire, because there are endowed chairs where, you take the Kissinger endowed chair, there's some trade-offs there. So no one really cares, but at least for my own conscience, I'm glad that it was somebody who's interested in peace more than conflict. But in general, yeah, it's been a strange period for IR scholars. We thought we had it all. I've been teaching Intro to IR for over a decade now, and I do find myself having to update the syllabus just a bit, given everything that's going on that you mentioned. We had a period of relative, I don't want to say stability, but at least not many big things changing after the Cold War was over. And we're clearly done with that part of our history, and we're moving into something new and different, and probably something worse, but I'm
Yeah,
sure we'll talk about that.
I think we will. So Aftershocks came out in 2017, and if I can dare to summarize the argument, it argues that sudden shifts in great power dominance or hegemonic shocks drive waves of change around the world, both democracy and autocracy. I mean, first of all, is that about right? And then is the Trump presidency a hegemonic shock? And does the present moment feel like the kind of event or period that your framework was built to analyze?
Yeah, that's a very fair summary. I think the book came out of a kind of frustration about theories of democracy that focused on what was going on inside the country, which makes perfect sense, of course. If you want to know why things change, look at what's happening inside the country. But often these changes were embedded in larger structural changes in the international system. So the world wars or the Great Depression or the Soviet collapse. So those are the sources of these shocks that created these giant waves of reform. Are we in a shock right now? I don't think so. I don't think it quite reaches that threshold, because we'd have to see a very sudden decline in multiple visible measures of American power. And we're seeing some of that clearly under Trump. The US hegemony is in a much worse position now than it was even a few years ago, but it's not at the level of the Soviet collapse or the world wars or the Great Depression. Those are the kinds of cataclysmic shocks that really changed the institutional landscape. What we're seeing now is something more gradual, but nevertheless, definitely a shift from US dominance and sort of US standing as a model to be emulated to now where basically everybody's looking around going, what the fuck is going on? This is definitely not the model to follow, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a shock in that way, but it's definitely a dramatic shift in the international system.
That makes sense. Although it does make me wonder because I think perhaps it was the first piece of yours that I read that suddenly made me think, oh, this is a person who can explain some of what's going on in the world to me. Was your article, it was a summary of the year 2025, and you wrote about a hegemonic suicide. And you're talking about the United States and also referring to the Soviet Union. So, I mean, that does seem to indicate that, the hegemon is at significant risk of collapse if you're talking about suicide, right?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. The USSR was in a much worse position materially than the US is today. So I don't want to make the two cases equivalent. But, look, I've already lived through one great power adopting policies that caused it to implode. And I thought that was it. I thought that was done. I was done. But turns out we're doing it again, another case. And as I brought up in that piece you mentioned, like, why is that happening? Two times in a row where a great power seemingly withdraws from global power, adopts policies that undermine its own power. Why is that? And I think some of it might have to do with the nature of conflict today. Like, great powers can't fight wars anymore because of nuclear weapons. They can't fight directly with each other. And the engine of history has been great power war. That's what causes institutional change. That's what causes a lot of changes. And if you can't have hegemonic war, then you have hegemonic suicide, right? States no longer die from competing with each other; they die from institutional senescence or becoming ossified from the inside. That's what happened to the USSR. It seems to be what's happening to the US to some extent. I mean, I'm curious how you think about it, but I don't think the US is at the same level though that the USSR was in the late 80s.
I mean, I suppose the huge difference, and like any comparison we make with our current time to the Second World War, it faces the same problem, is the difference in resources. I mean, yeah, as you mentioned, the USSR being so much poorer. I mean, the thought that occurred to me when I read the piece was thinking of two suicides, the USSR being the suicide of a bankrupt alcoholic who just cannot make it past his 70th birthday and just does himself in. Whereas America's suicide is kind of a Nepo baby who just can't stop taking all the drugs and eating all the food and crashing the fast car he inherited. But, he's got good health care, so maybe the suicide is going to be prolonged.
That's the tragedy, right? It's nothing was forced on the US, right? Gorbachev found himself under circumstances where his choices were limited. The US has repeatedly found itself in pretty good circumstances and kind of, at least in the last case, just kind of chose to fuck it up.
Yeah, yeah,
Just a
yeah.
self-inflicted wound, hence the suicide part. That is the real tragedy here. Is none of this had to happen.
Yeah, I do wonder why it did happen. And I start to think of books like, Amusing Ourselves to Death. I immigrated to the United States from China, and I'm originally from South Africa. I moved here in 2015, and I live in Tennessee near Nashville. When I moved here, I thought this is like kind of paradise. I mean, sure, you worry about school shootings and the healthcare system sucks, but pretty much everything else in America, compared to most of the rest of the world, where I've spent most of the rest of my life, is just extraordinary. So seeing people so angry at the system in 2015 and then voting in Trump was something that I'm still struggling to comprehend, which is why I think the hegemonic suicide concept sort of really made sense to me, because I suddenly thought, okay, this kind of makes the gut feel about this theory is right.
Yeah. Well, I also have the immigrant's faith for America. Like yourself, I moved to the US. I'm a US citizen still, even though I live in Canada.
Ah, okay.
And I lived in the US for 20 years. Coming from the late Soviet Union, it was a paradise, obviously.
Yeah.
even though we moved to Flint, Michigan,
Right.
which is probably one of the worst cities in the country.
You kind of moved to the USSR of America.
That's right. But American USSR is way better than Russian USSR, at least at that point. I went to grocery stores and I was excited. I didn't know any better. To me, that was great.
Yeah. So let me quote from your piece, "The strong will suffer what they must," also on your newsletter. And it starts off quoting Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at Davos earlier this year, the speech that made a lot of waves and had the intended effect of signaling that Canada had to face the reality that the so-called liberal or rules-based international order had become too hypocritical or even fictional to be sustained. And forgive the lengthy quote, but I think this will set up the question right for the listener, and you are more eloquent than my paraphrase would be. So I quote, "Usually it's dangerous to have an intellectual in office, but Carney comes from the world of finance and therefore has the requisite amount of cynicism. So it's only right he opened his speech by quoting Thucydides. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The aphorism," he added, "is presented as inevitable, the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. As the rest of the speech suggests, there's nothing natural about it. People who consider themselves tough-minded pragmatists love to pluck this line from the Melian dialogue. They invoke it as timeless wisdom about power politics and a corrective to liberal delusions." And you go on to quote the odious Stephen Miller's statement to CNN, "Jake, the world is governed by strength." And you talk about this being the governing philosophy of Trump's second term and also exactly what brings down hegemons. Could you tell us why the sort of Stephen Miller reading misses the point entirely?
Sure. Jeremy, first of all, would you be willing to read all of my posts? Because that was great.
Yeah, I probably would.
Yeah, so something about the accent just makes it extra dignified.
Americans like the accent, I have to
I know
say.
you do get positive discrimination in the US.
Oh, absolutely.
You get too much credit actually due to your accents.
Too much, way too much.
Yeah.
And, you know, now there's even an official affirmative action policy for me because I'm a white South African, so,
Ah,
you know.
yes, that's right. You're one of the administration's favorites,
Yeah,
as am I, a Russian. So,
yes.
although I'm still uncomfortable crossing borders right now.
Yeah, the ICE is in the airports as we speak, so
Yes. Anyway, so yeah, so that quote, "The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must," it is kind of used as like, here's this timeless wisdom about the reality of power in the world. But the way it's meant in the book, at least I think an interpretation of the way it's meant in the book is these are people totally drunk on their own power. They have no interest in diplomacy. They have no interest in negotiating with those they consider weaker than them. And so they said, look, this is what you have to do. Otherwise, you suffer. The millions say no, and they do suffer. But Athens is so drunk on its power that, it starts the Sicilian expedition a year later, loses a lot of its navy and its army, and just loses the war, loses its empire. Its walls are destroyed. So I think the point of that quote, which I think Carney is correct about, is that this is not the eternal equilibrium of history. It's that people who think rules don't apply to them will find themselves under very difficult circumstances. People who think they've risen above and they don't need the so-called weak anymore will find themselves overmatched very quickly. That's what happened to Athens, and I think we're seeing some of that happening in the US as well. I mean, just look at Iran, where the US starts this war. It doesn't go quite as planned, if they even had a plan. It doesn't seem like it. And then the US is asking for help all of a sudden from its allies. Well, all of a sudden the limits of US power become very visible. And I think the real lesson of that quote, of the Thucydides quote, is great powers, when they lose self awareness, when they lose awareness of their limits, when they think rules don't apply to them, when they think the strong should be able to do whatever they want, that's when bad things happen to great powers, historically speaking. And so far, at least the US seems to be following that trajectory as well.
And Stephen Miller and the gang are falling straight into the trap that we could have learned about by reading ancient history. So 2025 year in review, it also touches on some other things I'd like to ask you about. And the first is the return of the medieval peasant brain. And you wrote a separate piece on how to, monetize the medieval peasant brain for downwardly mobile people such as myself, which I really should get into the supplements business. But tell me about the medieval peasant brain. What is it and why is it everywhere now?
We're doing visual education right now.
That's right. We're doing a podcast. It's not
Yeah,
text. Yeah.
that's right.
You can listen to it on the treadmill.
That's right. It's a phrase that I've heard before. I don't know how long it's been around, but it's this idea of this emerging mentality of a person who doesn't know much about the world, but has certain confident theories that may not be rooted in reality. Because just as medieval peasants sought explanations for things they had no awareness of, people are doing the same today. And this is a very like snob take on things, but I have to be unapologetically a snob about this. Just the rise of people who believe in magical thinking, these pseudo cures, and false medicines, conspiracy theories, often involving immigrants and ethnic minorities. Because when bad things happen, we want explanations, right? It's not enough to say that things are random or that bad things simply happen. People culprits that people want explanations, and I think social media has given rise to a number of people who provide those explanations in a very convincing, sort of telegenic way, and that's what determines their credibility. Not so much the content, but how they deliver it, and I think that has shaped a lot of how people, or increasingly how people think these days. It's an unfortunate development.
How do you think it affects politics? Because I think one of the interesting things about this phenomenon is that it's not a left or a right phenomenon. It's equal, I think, on both sides. You have sort of broadly liberal hippie type people who believe in bullshit medicine. And you have the exact same equivalent on the right. And they seem to sort of merge in the middle in the United States in the person of RFK Jr., the health secretary determined to bring the plague back. Do you think it affects people's political choices? Is the susceptibility to a carnival barker like Trump connected to medieval peasant brain?
Yeah, I think certainly there's a deep link almost to the like the reptile brain of this is our group, this is what makes me feel good. And it is bipartisan in a way because you find this kind of thinking among the left too. And it's very easy to get sidetracked by that because it's so annoying on the left. That's why I find myself getting into more fights with the left on social media because they're supposed to be on my side,
Yeah.
right? Whereas you expect it from the right. They're supposed to be paranoid idiots, whatever. And I think the difference is here's the asymmetry is the left is annoying, the right actually has power, right? So their paranoid conspiracy thinking translates into bad policy, whereas the left conspiracy thinking translates into substacks and tweets, which is
And crystal shops.
that's right, which is annoying, but not nearly as politically consequential.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is somewhat different having to smell patchouli oil near the crystal shop compared to having, vaccines pulled because RFK Jr. is crazy. So another depressing trend you mentioned in your review is the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, and obviously that is connected to medieval peasant brain, and
Mhm.
this has got much worse since you wrote it, just in the first few months of this year. And judging from news in the last week, it looks like we can expect many more violent attacks on Jewish organizations worldwide, aside from all the open anti-Semitism on Twitter and elsewhere. Obviously, global horror at the Netanyahu regime's actions in Gaza and Iran and Lebanon is a major factor, but anti Semitism is often talked about as a significant indicator of other deep seated ills in society that may have nothing to do with Jews. And the type of right wing American anti Semitism that we're seeing, as maybe best symbolized by Elon Musk's Hitler salute, does not always seem hostile to Israel. I mean, that's being tested right now, I think. But what do you make of the rise of anti-Semitism? Why this ancient prejudice is striking back in 2026?
Yeah, well, you already mentioned Israel's behavior. I think we cannot ignore that. It's a tricky subject to talk about because, like, well, I'm Jewish, I'm not atheist.
Ish, yeah, me too. I got you.
Yeah, so it's difficult to talk about partly because when you say Israel is endangering Jews around the world, people will come back to you and say, well, it's the people who are actually killing Jews or assaulting Jews that are in there, which is fair enough, of course. That's not to be sort of, I guess, capitulationist about that source of it. But I think it's pretty clear. I mean, speaking myself as a human, like Israel's behavior has been atrocious. So people who are not as maybe politically informed or whatever, of course they were going to see an overlap between Jews and Israel, right? And Israel encourages that by taking on the mantle of this is the home of the Jews, this is the global sort of this is where Jews feel safe.
As do all the leading American Jewish fundraising and advocacy organizations.
That's right. That's right. That's a big problem. But I think there are also other things at work here, like you mentioned, the sort of structural factors. Anytime there's economic inequality or economic issues, people look for scapegoats. There's also, I think, the basic sort of failing of the living memory of the Holocaust. The survivors are not there anymore, or at least increasingly not there anymore. The people who fought the war are not there anymore. So when an event passes into historical memory from living memory, it changes, I think, in a way that's irreversible, irretrievable. It becomes more distant. It becomes less of this sacred object. It becomes just another thing compressed into history. And so it's really a combination of a bunch of things, right, happening right now, almost a perfect storm of anti-Semitism. People in power right now, some of whom are pro-Israel yet still anti-Semitic, as you point out, and some of them are just straight anti-Semitic. The memory of the Holocaust is fading away. We have the economic problems and Israel's behavior. So all of these factors together are combining to, I think, brings anti-Semitism back. And the way I see it is, it's kind of depressing, but it's kind of the default state of Western society. Anti-Semitism has been there for a long time, and there was a pause after the 1940s or 50s where it became less socially acceptable in the US especially. And I feel like that pause is now ending. And society, in many ways, is returning to the default state, which is anti Semitism. This is a very troubling development. I think it's symptomatic of the ending of the great pause that we had, all the things since 1945, the spread of liberal democracy and all of that was probably an exceptional time. Like that's now ending, a very unusual time in world history that we took for granted and now will soon miss, I think.
We did. I now look back on the 90s and even early 2000s with the most awful old man's nostalgia.
That might just be our own nostalgia for youth.
That's definitely part of it.
Nostalgia is a very dangerous sentiment. It's a very reactionary feeling.
Yes.
It's rarely useful.
Yes.
You have to be careful when you think back
Yes.
to the 90s and all of that. But at the same time, yes, it was a different
You
period.
know, I don't think you can question, though, that it was an extraordinarily optimistic period around the world. I mean, I was traveling extensively in Africa and Asia at that time, and everywhere there was this idea that democracy was taking hold, that kind of that markets were going to solve all the problems, borders were coming down. I mean, that's not just rose-tinted kind of what do you call it, sepia glasses of nostalgia, right? I mean, things are different now. The wars are going back up. We're not talking about increased globalization. We're talking about sort of balkanization of the world, aren't we?
Yeah, no, that was real. That's undeniable. And probably when people mistook you for an American back then, it was a good thing in the late 90s. Not so much the case anymore. I remember taking a class in the early 2000s with a professor who's known for being sort of very anti-globalization. Not anti, but he thought it was a fad, basically, based on American hegemony. And as American hegemony faded, globalization would fade away too. And the students just looked at him with such contempt, like, oh, you poor, old, deluded man. Globalization is here. It's a fact of life, et cetera, et cetera. And you know what? He was completely right. It's largely a function of the international order and global hegemony, and we're seeing that.
We're saying that, yeah. So you recently co-wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs with Semuhi Sinanoglu. Did I get that
Mm,
right?
mhm, mhm.
And you argue that the world's most powerful states, Russia, China, and the United States, are now governed by leaders who are personalists. They purge opposition, they ignore formal institutions, and they rule through inner circles of sycophants, making policy based on private fixations instead of national interests. How long has this convergence been building, do you think? And is there any reason why it sort of crystallized in roughly in this window?
Yeah. Do you know about carcinization in biology, where every creature eventually turns crab-like?
Yes, I've heard of that, but perhaps you could explain a little
Well,
more.
I'm not a biologist, but apparently there's something about the way nature optimizes things that a bunch of creatures take crab-like shapes because of their environment. And I think autocracies are similar in that eventually a lot of them start to look like personalist autocracies. That is, there's one single person that sort of says, all right, I'm in charge now, and kind of gathers the state around himself. It's always a he so far. And that becomes a personalist regime. There are no formal institutions. Everything is done through the person. That person is the arbiter of disputes among the elites. And that's why he's useful, right? The elites need a focal point to help them adjudicate these disputes. Putin serves that function, for example. And that's very different than the traditional sort of, let's say, Brezhnev regime, where it's obviously autocratic, but there's collective decision making. There's no collective decision making when it comes to Putin. I mean, he obviously has an inner circle with which he consults, but they're all sort of yes men who will feed him information needed to portray them as loyal. So why is it happening now? And China is the same thing. Like the explicit purpose was to prevent one man rule in China, right? They had these informal term limits.
After Mao.
After Mao, exactly,
Yeah.
specifically to prevent that, right?
Mm.
I mean, you lived in China, you know all about this. You were there for a long time. And Xi has kind of also done away with that, away with term limits, purging the party, purging the military, centralizing rule around himself. And he's probably not going to go away because of term limits. And Trump exhibits some of these same behaviors. Career bureaucrats are pushed out or mistrusted. He operates through sort of these friends almost who serve as his intermediaries, like Witkoff, that he knows from real estate deals from the 80s. Right? These are not professional diplomats. In fact, he mistrusts those kinds of people, right? And he operates through his own inner circle and doesn't even operate through his own party, really. So we have this convergence of three very powerful countries operating in this similar personalistic way. That's kind of what the piece is about. And that's a long time since that happened, probably since the 1930s when we had powerful states, all personalist. That's a troubling comparison for obvious reasons. And so I guess basically what we wanted to put forward is that it's not just that they're personalist regimes, it's that when they start interacting, when two personalists interact, it's really bad because they're both in their isolation chambers, they're both in their bubbles, they're both encouraged by these sycophantic advisors. They have no incentives to back down or fewer incentives to back down because they don't want to look weak. So the idea is that a world where we have personal great powers is potentially unstable and could lead to problems. If you're optimistic, maybe it's a good thing because then they can cut deals informally and can bypass the bureaucracy. That's kind of the flip side. We'll see. We'll see if that actually becomes true.
They're also quite different in a way because, I mean, Trump, unlike Xi and Putin, didn't inherit an autocratic regime. He's constructing one. And it seems to me that Xi, unlike Putin and Trump, I mean, obviously it's a personalist regime, but Trump and Putin both seem to have some kind of like a medieval peasant brain, or maybe Putin, it's Cossack brain. But Xi seems actually focused on the development of real national power. I mean, his photos everywhere. His name is in the top headlines of the People's Daily and the official Xinhua news agency every single day. You can't get away from him. If you're a party member, you have to study Xi thought every day. And, there's an app that makes sure you do it. And the headline, however, is usually about some economic good, not about Xi's feat at swimming or his thought. The headline's about disciplinary instructions to the Communist Party. Obviously, there are times when you can see the weaknesses, and it appears that there are yes men surrounding Xi, not giving him good information. And the last time that appeared to be happening was COVID zero, when under Xi, China just kept this extremely strict policy that was extremely deleterious, I think, to the economy and to the national mood, essentially. But I mean, aside from that, most of the decisions he makes don't seem to be catered to inflating his own ego. And that seems rather different from Putin and Trump. Did you think about that as you were writing the article, the differences in their styles?
Absolutely. I mean, he's still kind of considered the more rational among the three, at least from an outside perspective. For some of the reasons you mentioned, right? He's not interested in pursuing these wars or historical grievances, at least for now. He's interested in economic development. But there's something about being entrenched in power for years and decades that causes people to lose their judgment, especially over time. So I think the longer he stays ensconced in that position, the more likely that he receives bad information and miscalculates. The COVID zero is a good example that you mentioned, that we also mentioned in the piece, where policy didn't seem to be optimal, and yet there was nobody there to tell him otherwise, it seems. So I'm not optimistic that he's going to become more perceptive about his country's situation in the future if he keeps doing what he's doing now and purging his generals like he did a few weeks ago. There's obviously still serious institutional trust issues that China has to develop or go through. You were there for a while, right? Did you find that the treatment changed of Xi over time, or
I was there from 1995 to 2015 and have worked, in media following China news closely even since I left. So I, was there for the end of the Jiang era, the whole Hu Jintao era, and then the first years of Xi. I think he came on very strong right away. There was very clear right from the very beginning, from late 2012, there were signs that this was a man on a mission, and it hasn't really changed since then. I think that COVID zero was the first time when I started to think, okay, the cracks are starting to show. And it does make me think that, or perhaps reminds me that China is much more fragile than it appears. And right now in the United States, looking at this absolute craziness, China appears like an island of calm and stability. But, it faces enormous challenges. And I think it's absolutely true that it's impossible that Xi Jinping is getting good information all the time. There's just too much sycophancy built into the system. And anybody with any kind of independent voice has been silenced. And that I observed happening in real time. People being arrested or silenced, harassed, organizations shut down, civil society organizations harassed into non-existence, lawyers locked up, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's not so much that I felt that you've seen a decline in Xi or him noticeably becoming more personalist over the time, but the effects of his regime of zero tolerance of dissent are becoming more and more obvious all the time.
yeah, that's usually not a good recipe for long-term policymaking.
No, it's not. It's not. And I think as much as China seems to really be in a great spot right now, perhaps one of your other pieces points to, some of the troubles that are stored up for it ahead. You got your multipolar world. Now what? You wrote a piece that has a wicked irony at its center. Since Putin gave a speech in Munich in 2007, loudly pushing for a multipolar world where great powers do what they want in their own backyards without sanctions or interference, Trump's foreign policy has been a gift to Putin's vision, and Xi Jinping certainly is on board with the vision of a multipolar world, using that exact phrase. But you suggest Putin may not actually like what he's gotten in the new multipolar world, and I would suggest that Xi Jinping might not like it either. Why do you think it might go wrong for Putin?
Well, he wants a world where his imperial ambitions are not constrained by the liberal order, where Russia can basically exercise its influence as it sees fit. That requires getting rid of the liberal order, right? And that's what Putin, as you say, has been pushing for. But what do they get if they get rid of it? Which is what they're getting, right? What Trump is offering Putin what he's wanted, which is the replacement of the liberal order with this multipolar order, where states are no longer constrained by these rules or norms, where you get a world where might makes right, like that Stephen Miller quote you mentioned earlier. But Russia, what is actually happening with Russia? Well, the economy is not doing so great. Its GDP growth is below 1% now. It was doing pretty okay for a couple of years because of basically war spending. It's losing its clients and allies. It's bleeding out its army with over 1 million casualties and no sign that going to be rapid change on the military front. It's facing huge demographic problems, partly because of the war, but it lost over 1 million people already in COVID excess mortality. So you've got this world where might makes right, but you don't have that much might, at least not as much as you think you do. China is clearly way more powerful than Russia, and Russia knows this, and it's become increasingly more so over the past few years. After 22, Russia relies on China increasingly as a client for selling gas and oil, but also just for goods that it needs. And to even continue fighting the war, it needs help from China. So that's not a comfortable position. If you are now in a raw, anarchic spheres of influence world and you're Russia, this is what you've wanted all along. I think Putin is either discovering or will soon discover that the liberal order had some nice things about it. He would never admit it. He would never say this, but the liberal order was beneficial to Russia in some ways. It created a degree of stability. It allowed Russia to use international law when it suited it. It allowed it to use its UN Security Council position. When all that goes away, what do you have left? A failing economy, a military that's bleeding out, a society that's basically very miserable if we judge by opinion polls. That's not a good position to be in. I think he will miss that liberal order that he railed against for so long. And I think he'll find that there are lots of positive things about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I mean, I suspect that China will be the same. It obviously is in a much stronger position than Russia economically and on the way militarily. I don't understand how one would compare the two, but it's clearly a formidable military power. But it's also a global trade, a country whose wealth is partly dependent on global trade and extraction of global resources, whose free passage has been until now protected by the United States. So I can see a lot of downsides for China too.
That's right. Public goods are for everybody. What have you been working on? What are you up to?
I haven't been working on anything interesting enough to discuss.
Okay.
So, but maybe we can talk about China a little bit more. But let me ask a few more questions about your work. You wrote about peace framing the three Gulf Wars as a continuous arc of hegemonic decay. And if you don't mind me reading your work to you again, I quote, "Time has a way of compressing history. The Hundred Years' War was a series of three separate wars that must have felt as distinct to its contemporaries as the world wars feel to us now. But those three wars were a long time ago, so we lump them together into one conflict. Besides, we are wise. We have seen the direction of history and know they were all fought over the unresolved question of England's rivalry with France. I suspect future historians will apply the same compression to the three Gulf Wars of the unipolar era. While 1991, 2003, and 2026 are distinct in many ways, they all revolve around repeated attempts by the hegemon to impose its order on a region that it appears to understand less and less each time. Can you talk about that regression and what it says about the United States?
Yeah. Again, beautiful job reading. You should do this professionally.
Okay,
I love it.
I'm up for it.
Yeah, so it's just a kind of a framing device to look at the three wars as the decline of U.S. hegemony. They really are kind of a neat marking points in the sense that 91 was this triumphant birth of a new order, right? Bush called it the New World Order, and everybody seemed to be on board, even the Arab states. And then 2003, the U.S. is basically at its peak, and it again goes to war, this time for reasons that are much less clear. I was actually in DC at the time, and I was working for a news organization. I remember talking to Richard Pearl. Do you remember him?
Yes, remind me, he was the
He was one of the architects of the war in the Bush administration. And basically, I asked him, so what happens if you don't find the WMDs? This is maybe a month after the invasion. And he said, "No, we'll find the WMDs. Don't you worry. We'll find them." And I said, "Well, okay, just as a hypothetical, what happens if you don't find them?" He said, "No, that's not even a hypothetical. We're going to find
wow.
them." Yeah. They sincerely believed in the cause, which didn't make it any less false, but at least they manufactured one. At least they worked hard to manufacture one. Whereas, what's going on the last 2 weeks, I mean, it's a complete shit show. Nobody knows what the hell is going on. There's no justification. There's no plan. There doesn't seem to be any contingency planning. And it's each time it's the US going to war in the region for reasons that become more and more removed from its national interest to the point where it's totally disconnected from national interest. And we could ask why. And I think if you ask a realist, they'll tell you, well, that's easy. Anytime you have a unipolar hegemon, they basically do whatever the hell they want. It has nothing to do with the character of the state. It has nothing to do with American exceptionalism. This is just what great powers do. They overreach, they screw up, and then they get into these dumb wars. So if you're a sort of a classical realist, this is not surprising. The real surprise is that it took so long, that it took 30 plus years for US unipolarity to overextend itself in that way, which is in some ways a credit to the liberal order, right? As much as we talk shit about the liberal order, I think we're going to miss it very soon. And it's a testament to its binding powers that the US was a hyperpower, a superpower for so long without causing balancing against it, without causing that much hatred toward it. And it took Trump, like it took several decades. So, yes, in a way, maybe you could say to the realists, this is inevitable, but let's have a hand for the American liberals who put up a pretty good institutional order for a few decades, despite all its many problems.
Yeah. So you asked me kind of what I was working on. And one of the reasons I'm struggling to answer that right now is I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by everything, not only the news, but also the sort of information environment, just this the graphomania, the extraordinary abundance of websites and newsletters and TikToks and AI slop and so much stuff to read and listen to and watch. And sometimes it just feels like publishing anything at all is just adding to this tsunami of meaningless information. And that's something I've
We
been
are contributing to this.
we are contributing to this, So it's not what I'd call work, but it's been the sort of, I suppose, intellectual preoccupation of mine recently. And it's partly connected to another thing you wrote about how spiritually exhausting elements of current events are, so that it's actually impossible to discuss certain things. Like you have a piece about how the Epstein affair and Russiagate are basically the same thing. So it's impossible to discuss some of the details of this case, you write. Like the same man involved in laundering money through a Trump real estate deal is now helping or hindering or whatever he's doing to negotiate the end of Europe's largest war. You can't actually talk about these things without sounding like a conspiratorial lunatic. And I mean, this is sort of part of it. Is not only is there too much information, but some of the information we're getting, which is actually true, is so bizarre. But the question is that your piece argues that the Epstein affair and Russiagate both represent the same underlying phenomenon. What exactly is that phenomenon, and why do we keep reaching for the wrong analytical frames to understand it?
Yeah. So Trump's connections to Russia, especially his financial connections, have been something I've been interested in for a long time. I got on Twitter in 2017, I think. I waited until I got tenure, which is probably a good idea. And my first sort of big thread was about Trump's financial connections to Russia, where there was a lot of talk about Russiagate and how Putin is trying to destroy American democracy. And my point back then was it's less about Putin and more about the financial links, more about the money. So Trump has connections to Russian money going back to the 80s, even going back to the Soviet period. And we see a lot of the same thing with the Epstein case, where it's, yes, part of it is the prostitution and the child trafficking, but part of it is he acts as a sort of intermediary between powerful people, doing favors, asking favors, connecting people together. I think both the Epstein case and Russiagate are manifestations of this global financial network that really emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the world really became unified financially in many ways, where these powerful people are essentially operating at a jurisdiction above state level, right? Where they're no longer bound by national territory. This is the real sort of global oligarchic class. And those connections you find in the Trump case, Russian oligarchs delivering money through intermediaries to the Trump campaign. You find some of the same characters even in the Epstein files. So I think for me, at least, that's the way to see both Russiagate and Epstein files as this part of transnational kleptocracy. So I think it's easy to present the Russiagate case as this cringe lib paranoia, but I think a lot of it turned out to be true. A lot of those financial links, the shady links, turned out to be true. And as you say, it's impossible to talk about them without sounding a little bit crazy and conspiratorial. But that's the fact. And I think that's one way to get a handle on both is to see them as the same manifestation of this oligarchic transnational class that takes root and really thrives after the Soviet collapse.
And in our eagerness to have stories and narratives, both Russiagate and Epstein, we tend to want to see them as a more complete conspiracy. Russiagate was all about Putin actually trying to secure Trump's victory, and Epstein was, whatever your particular flavor of belief about what was going on there, was a particular thing that had a political aim or had a particular criminal aim. And it was all about one thing, whereas it wasn't all about one thing. Both cases are about people with access to people with power and money helping each other.
That's exactly right. And I think that's a inconvenient way to present it for some people and for certain, I don't know, mainstream publications, but I think that's really what it is.
It's much less satisfying than a proper conspiracy theory.
It is. That's the unsatisfying thing about reality.
Yeah, it's not very satisfying.
No.
So, last question. This show has been built around, obviously, the idea that history rhymes, that people who've lived through or studied political upheaval elsewhere can give American audiences a kind of advanced map of what's coming, or at least that's what I set out to do in February last year, shortly after Trump got back in as president. And I've been trying to work out, part of the reason, aside from my existential dread of AI and graphomania, part of the reason I've been on somewhat of a hiatus is I'm also trying to work out what that actually means right now. I don't think American audiences can get an advanced map from studying other countries anymore. We are our own example now. America is now perhaps the advanced map of other countries. So there's something about the metaphor that I have to find a new way of phrasing what I'm trying to explore. But you've spent your career studying exactly the types of patterns I'm interested in: hegemonic transitions, democratic backsliding, personalist capture of institutions. When people who've lived through these things in other countries watch what's happening in the United States, when you watch these things, is there anything that surprises you about what we're seeing now? What do foreigners see about the American condition, I think is my real question, that Americans are missing?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on your positionality, like not to use this trendy academic term, but I kind of don't feel like an insider into in America, but I guess I'm not an outsider either. I'm a US citizen. So that may shape my perspective. I think the surprising thing for me, having grown up in the USSR, is how many people in the US think things cannot get worse. That is, they assume that even people who are, maybe they think that my life is bad already. How much worse can it get? It can get much worse. I think the surprising thing for me is how much Americans take for granted of just what they have, just how much they enjoy unthinkingly. That is, how much they enjoy without knowing that they should be enjoying this, and how much better they have it than many places. Even places like the UK, you visit and you see parts of it, like it looks poor, right? Americans, I think, take for granted how wealthy we or they, I don't know if I should say we or they, how
Yeah,
wealthy.
I'm in that position too. I kind of can't quite settle on the right pronoun.
Yeah. So that to me is the biggest thing that I wish people growing up in the rich country would understand is things can get way worse. It can get way worse.
Yeah, Russians seem to understand that particularly worse, that things can always get worse and they probably will.
Yes, I think there's a reason we think that. Yeah.
All right, Seva, what a pleasure talking to you. I could talk to you all day, and I really encourage our listeners to subscribe to the Hegemon newsletter and follow Seva wherever he talks and writes. And he is a very good writer in an age of medieval peasants. So for the three of you out there who still read, Hegemon. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei, and our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much. Thank you, Seva.
Thank you, Jeremy.